I want to talk about semen retention. Women don't understand it, but men also, they think that it's avoiding sex. They think that it's avoiding orgasm.
And there is also a bit of a difference between men and women in the way they relate to their sexuality. So for women, sexual liberation, getting rid of shame and guilt around expressing themselves. And of course, this is also true for men to some extent. But I feel for men, it's more about sexual mastery, which involves an element of, I wouldn't say control, but command. You want to liberate, of course, you don't want to suppress the sexual energy, but it has to be contained. Uncontained sexual energy is very unattractive. And so there is that element that men need to cultivate to get the most out of this powerful force.
So a man being able to lead a woman, but then shift into being led by her. What does that really look like in this practice?
A man can actually not lead until he has mastered his sexual energy, because until then, the sexual energy is leading him, whether he knows it or not. So he has to take care of that first, and then he can actually start thinking about leading. And yes, like on the outside, it will look like he's leading. He starts a movement, but then she finishes it. So most of the movement is actually hers. And he just makes a little adjustment with his hand, like a little push, a little this, and she just takes that and finishes it. He's going exactly where she wants to go, also. And so, but he's not leading the interaction for his own self gratification. He's leading towards her most expansive expression over herself, because that's really, once he can set aside his own pleasure and all of that, his own goals, his satisfaction is seeing her come into the fullest expression of who she is, and that's where he's leading her into. And yeah, this is the dance.
OG Mastery, the original gangsta, God and Goddess, all coming into mastery. We're coming into you. This is where we talk business, sex, relationships, money, health, entrepreneurship, and self-awareness. Now your host, Robyn Linn. How to last all night is an understatement when we invite in a sexual connected practice of what the ancient Taoists refer to as semen retention, otherwise referred to as orgasm without ejaculation. In today's OG Mastery episode, we'll speak with an extraordinary practitioner and men's coach, Dennis de Rechter, the Shaktivator on Instagram, who will guide us through the key benefits for men and the women they love, and the beautiful results of relationships, attaining self-confidence as a man, aside from being magnetic and physically receiving this, what I call the fountain of youth. This is a practice I recommend to men who desire attraction power, success, and fulfillment. And today, we welcome Dennis to OG Mastery. Welcome to OG Mastery, Dennis.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's amazing to have you here. We've been trying to schedule because you're out in Europe, and I know that there's a lot of exciting things happening around the world. One of the things that I am curious about before we get into everything, where you are located in the world, do you find that it's different for men to cultivate this kind of practice? Is it unique for men overall when we're cultivating sexual energy? Or do you find that there's a difference when we look at culture and how men are brought up by certain cultures around the world?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I mean, there are places that do feel a bit more conducive to me to do this kind of work. There's places such as Bali, perhaps, where life always seems to be abundant and flourishing. And so yes, it does feel easier to tap into that and to use that as a way to cultivate my own life force energy. So I would say places like Belgium, I'm visiting family at the moment, are not very as conducive for sure. There's a bit more noise, a bit more distortion, so to speak. But culturally wise, I mean, I feel there's a big trend of men moving towards becoming more aware of their relationship to their sexual energy and the life force energy. And there is a desire from their women as well for them to be more in command of that. And especially, yeah, with the rise of the porn industry, more so, it's more important than ever. So.
Yeah, that's something I was going to share with you that I found in a study last night. And it was a global self-pleasure report. And it said men who feel more are emerging in society and having better relationships. It said 56% of American men, 46% of British men, 40% of German men who feel more actually enjoy sex more. And it's interesting how we need a study to show us these results, because it's, I mean, for us, maybe practitioners who are used to being in touch with our body, being in touch with our feelings, being in touch with how we engage in the world, to us, it may seem obvious, right? To other people in society who may be more fixated on being projecting themselves in the world, accomplishing something in the world, doing things as the way they're told to do in society. They're so disconnected, not just from nature, but obviously from their bodies. And so I thought that this was an interesting study, but it said that 91% of women were interested in their man being in touch with his emotions. And it's obvious, right? But when we're looking at, because you mentioned porn, and there was a really well-known influencer on Instagram I found yesterday, and he talked about pleasure practice, and he talked about masturbation. And in his post, he said, please, women, stop shaming men for touching themselves. And one of the things that I commented on his post was, you know, there's nothing wrong with experiencing pleasure, but when it's in the form of escape, or if it's used as a coping mechanism to get out of a feeling, right? Like, there's so much that we actually should feel. We use masturbation as a way to escape what we're actually feeling. So is that one of the things that you work on with men in this environment, not just obviously reducing and eliminating porn, but is another part of it that cultivation of the self-pleasure practice? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're right. So the self-pleasure practice, especially if it's done uh, just as most people do it, when there's an ejaculation at the end, there's a release. This discharge is basically a great way to numb the underlying pain. So if I teach self-pleasure, it's more of it's more ritualized, and usually, or actually always, there is no ejaculatory orgasm in the end. So the practice would be to keep cultivating and resensitizing the system and holding holding everything, not just the pleasure, but also the underlying pain the man may be escaping from. And yeah, so and there is also a bit of a difference between um, men and women in their journey of, yeah, in the way they relate to their sexuality. So for women, it's been more of a journey of, at least from what I can tell, of sexual liberation and getting rid of shame and the guilt around expressing themselves. And of course, this is also true for men to some extent. But I feel for men, it's more about, not as much about sexual liberation, but sexual mastery, which involves an element of, I wouldn't say control, but command. Like you want to liberate, of course, you don't want to suppress the sexual energy, but it has to be contained. Uncontained sexual energy is very unattractive. And so there is that element that men need to cultivate to get the most out of this, yeah, this powerful force.
I just got the chills when you said that, because there's so much with this movement, like you mentioned Bali. There's so much of a disconnect in how we see sex based on gender. And I always talk about alchemy, and the seventh principle of alchemy is the principle of gender, which states at all times and all ways there's always masculine, feminine qualities. And I personally, about 12 years ago, I read this book, and I went and studied with Mantak Chia in Thailand recently. And this was a book, actually, it's called The Taoist Secrets of Love, Cultivating Male Sexual Energy. And when I read that, it's for men. When I read that, I understood the energy of the containment, as you mentioned, the containment of the masculine. And then what I was able to do, because I could then feel that in my own body of receiving the man, receiving the masculine within my own field of energy, within my own contained energy. But then, as you said, it's so interesting. And ladies, those women that are listening, and men that are listening too, for women, it's so important that the energy of the masculine, as Dennis said, is that containment of that power and that cultivation of mastery. And for the woman, the feminine, she's actually... She wants, needs, and is yearning to expand and explode. I mean, her body literally needs to just expand and explode. And I don't talk about this that much, but my first full body orgasm was about 39 years old, which wasn't too long ago. And when I had my full body orgasm, it was because the man that I was with, he was 50 years old, older than the other men that I had been with. And he had that energy of cultivating his own sexual energy. He didn't need to get off, but he was allowing me to be expressed for 5 hours. And when we finished making love, it was something where we ended up having a little snack, a little picnic on my floor, and then went back in and made love again for 3 hours. And it was one of those beautiful experiences, but I would not have been able to have received him if I hadn't understood that we're different. You know, when we come into the sexual experience, sometimes we want to merge, we want to connect, we want to feel together, but at the same time, I feel it's so important for women to understand that we're meant to feel so differently, actually the opposite, right? The polar opposite of what a man feels. So I want to talk a little bit about semen retention, and instead, because I know a lot of men that come to me, and I talk about this a lot publicly, how I personally am choosing to be with a man who's practicing this, not just for me, but for the container of our relationship dynamic. It's a choice for me. And a lot of women have never been with a man who retains. And women don't understand it. But men also, they think that it's avoiding sex. They think that it's avoiding orgasm. They think that they have to get mental. I think a lot of men think that it takes a lot of time to cultivate, which it may for some men. And some men feel that maybe it's too devotional. Maybe they're not ready for it, or they're not ready to make a change in their lives. But I want you to talk a little bit about that multi-orgasmic man, and that when men find this practice, as you're saying, cultivating this energy as a master of their own sexual energy, that they can actually, Dennis, orgasm through this retention without ejaculating, and that orgasm does not equal ejaculation. Can we talk about that just a bit?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting how for many men, like this kind of work is often put off until the end, like the last thing to take care of, whether it should be the first thing, because it affects everything else we do. It affects how we show up in our business, in our relationship. Like if we are not in control of our sexual energy, we're not in control of anything. So this is, you're either a slave or a master. And to take it head on, you have to start with this, because this is the most powerful force, and therefore also the most difficult, of course, to manage. And this is why perhaps we kind of postpone it until the last thing, until all the other things are taken care of. But it's the foundation. And
Mm.
yeah,
What you said, when I was studying with the monks at the monastery, I felt so comfortable because they're practicing restraint. And when you walk by, you can see it in their faces and in their bodies that they're, trying not to say, "Oh, what a beautiful, radiant, loving, feminine creature." You could see them practicing that. But one of the things that I had learned with my teacher is that in Thailand and in many practices in India, their rite of passage, they still practice that young boys, I think they start at the age of 6 or 8 years old, where they go out for 5 or 6 years and they actually study monk practices so that they can actually cultivate these retention practices. Is that something that you found with different cultures as well? Because, in America and Europe and in the Western world, they don't even know about these rites of passage. And you mentioned ritual. So can you talk a little bit more about that as a ritual practice?
yeah. So as Western people, we don't have much cultural context for these practices, which is unfortunate because a lot of context and guidance is necessary. There's a very fine line between containment and suppression of sexual energy. It's a very fine line. You can the practice can quickly become a form of suppressing, and so it is absolutely essential to find people who can guide you along the way, and stay in that sweet spot. And that's probably the most difficult part of this practice, is to learn how to liberate the sexual energy from the inside, but keep it contained on the outside. That's an art in itself, and that's perhaps the best definition of mastery, is to be able to do those, to find that sweet spot.
Mm. I mean, even just you speaking to it, in my body, I feel relaxed, but yet excited, right? I feel energized and yet calm. I feel open, but yet not excitable, like out of body. One of the things I found, being a highly sexual being, is that I went and studied yoga in 2007 at an ashram, Shivananda, and we were doing a breathing exercise. It was the first time I did a really deep breath work. We were out in public, outside with 70 other people, and I ended up raising my kundalini and having an orgasm out on the space there on the deck in front of everyone, as everyone's just casually breathing, and I'm like full body opening with my kundalini. And one of the things I found, and I'd love for you to talk about this a little bit, is that I didn't know what to do with that energy. And so what ended up happening was I ended up getting, I had a life partner at the time, and I wanted sex 24/7, and he couldn't keep up with me. And I ended up leaving him, unfortunately for him, but, and I wish him well. But one of the things I found was that my ability to take that energy and use it and circulate it. I didn't know, I was 20 something at the time. I didn't know how to direct it as a woman because it's so intense. And is it the same for men? Can you talk a little bit about that? When, my background started in yoga, which then led to Buddhism, which then led to Taoism, which then led to alchemy. And my foundation is in Kabbalah as my lineage. But do you find that with a lot of men, that they come to you, or maybe in general you see men out in the world and they're just out there with their Shiva Shakti, just insanely wild out in the world, and they're not really understanding that it's not about expending outward, but it's actually about bringing it inward? Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Yes, for men, like of course there is a potential for similar experiences such as full body orgasm and yeah, moving the orgasmic sensations up through the body. Personally, my experiences has been more in the sense that it's been a shift from orgasm as an event, as an experience, to orgasm as more like a state of being. It's more like a frequency. There's been moments where I've had these inner explosions, but for me, it's become more of like, yeah, that shift from an experience to a state, a frequency, and yeah, and just holding that frequency. So a lot of the work we do is also basically priming the body to be able to hold these frequencies longer and longer time. So that means, yeah, that goes all the way back to what you eat, even like all of these things that can be done for the body to be optimized to be able to actually even deal with this intensity. And that's where most of the work is. It's actually just, yeah, getting the body ready and all the preparation that is required for that.
Mm. If you look, as you're saying, if you look at the body as its own ecosystem, right? We have an ecosystem, and what are we putting? What's the input? What's the output? And a lot of times in the Tao, we really work on cultivating the qi, but there's this practice that the Chinese have with vases. They have these big vases, and they Montauk had vases all over the Tao garden, and all of us were like, "What's in there? What's in there?" And he shared with us that his excess energy or negative energy was in there. So we honored them, but we weren't as excited to go and play with the vases. But we would walk by and we would feel this really intense energy. And so I ended up picking up a couple vases from Thailand, and I practice whenever I have excess energy. I expel that into the vase, and then I allow that to contain that energy. And if I ever need that kind of intensity, I'll go back and say, okay, I need this energy now. But I think it's a very conscious practice, what we're talking about, where maybe, and have you found this maybe for you, where it's kind of like enough is enough. I'm sick and tired of feeling drained or exhausted or not met. My needs not met, or my body is just a mess, and I don't understand how to feel like I can have this cultivation of energy. Because in the Tao, we really can understand that at all times we can always bring in the qi and work with the qi, or move the energy with qigong or with sexual practices. So do you think, like a tipping point for men where they get to a certain point and they just can't stand it anymore? Is it painful? Is it sad? Are they angry? Are they frustrated? Like, what is that for men that you have found, or maybe for yourself that you've experienced in finding this practice and saying, okay, this is something I'm going to actually do?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is essentially a fire ritual. To properly practice semen retention is a fire ritual because you are cultivating this fire inside of you. And my job is to keep people in the fire. That's what I do. Is because you want to jump out of it, right? And so in fact, there's two ways where you can deal with this situation. Is like, okay, you can use the energy horizontally, to have impact in the world, to create your business or be creative, whatever you want to do. That's a horizontal orientation. But then the real practice is actually the vertical orientation, which is directing it all upwards and allowing the fire to burn through you and allow it to illuminate you from the inside. And this is where it really becomes an initiation into mastery, by allowing, through the semen retention, allowing this fire to basically yes, illuminate the shadows from the inside and start mapping out your inner landscape. And also in the process, because it is a fire, it's also creating more inner space in the body at the same time.
When you found this practice, can you describe what you had experienced prior and what got you to want to actually start to cultivate this?
Yes, I was kind of I started 15 years ago and I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew that I didn't like how I felt after ejaculating. That was for me that was really obvious, and I didn't like the disconnect I experienced afterwards. There was always a bit of like I felt a bit jaded perhaps in some way, and also there was another element of feeling a bit maybe envious of the feminine, the female orgasm. I was like, wait a minute, I got the I don't have the like I was all a bit jealous, yeah, a bit envious of their experience. Their orgasm seems to be so much more rich than mine. And yeah, that's what really got me into it. And I was just like, without having any knowledge about it, I was like, I just told myself, okay, let's just do it once a week. And it then became once every 2 weeks, once every month. And I just felt the benefit. Like it's such an immediate effect in terms of energy and confidence. Back then, as a teenager, I was also a bit struggling with um, like worthiness and social anxiety and all of these things. And this kind of gave me a bit of momentum to start cultivating that masculine edge a bit more and to really, yeah, just have be a bit more penetrative in the way I hold myself and these things. So yeah, that's where it started for me. So
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned confidence and this energy of being maybe more self-assured. Can you talk a little bit more about this confidence piece and what this practice brings for men?
yeah, so I mean, this is something. This is, I think, a truth that nobody talks about, but a woman's sexual potential is so much bigger than a man's sexual potential, even though society tries to tell us that it's the opposite, but it's not. So if a man cannot master this, he's always going to fall short. And it doesn't matter how much she loves him. If he cannot meet her needs, it's just not going to work out. It's something that men know this. They know this. It's not talked about very often, but they know that if they cannot satisfy her needs, if they cannot keep up with her, it's a matter of time before the relationship just falls apart. And so yes, it is a very sensitive topic, and yes, the sexual, even though I like to teach men that it's not a performance, it's an act of self-expression, and yet if he is not able to perform, it's going to have consequences. And so there has to be this really deep and honest look at like, okay, how do I fix this? And mm,
And one of the other benefits we talked about was health and vitality and this ability to maybe, like you said, penetrate and direct the energy into business and purpose. And I remember about 20 years ago when I read Think and Grow Rich, one of the chapters was White Heated Desire. And he talks about retention practices there and how to hold your seed and then use that and direct that into your business goals. Is that something that you work a lot with men who maybe have a lot of drive for success, that you found that they can achieve more in the world with that penetration energy?
yes, yeah. So I mean, these practices used to be like reserved to like the elite, right? And now it's only recent that it's becoming more mainstream. And when I talk about retention, it's not just semen retention, it's retention at large as a whole. So if increasing the ability to retain your semen also increases the ability to retain anything else, like retain vitality, retain energy, retain power, retain health, retain wealth. Like it's the ability to retain overall. And therefore, of course, the more you can retain, you can have much more impact in any shape and form.
It's powerful. I took a year and a half of celibacy for myself, cultivating my sexual energy within myself, practicing my own pleasure practices, but in a way, what I remember, I was living in South Florida, Miami, which is a very aesthetic, sexual culture there. And I found that I was practicing this, right, for a year and a half. I would walk out the door, and within about 5 seconds, someone would be riding their bike by and just and it's a very magical feeling. And you know, we talk in alchemy about attraction and manifestation and magnetism, you know, when we attune our own energy fields, we attract back. And I wasn't doing it for the reason of getting attention. I was doing it for my own healing and my own well-being after leaving a 5.5-year relationship, so that I could just clear out my energy. And one of the things, I'm curious your take on this, and maybe, you know, maybe it's different for every individual. Do you find that it's when a man is in this practice and he's cultivated this, as we can say, level of mastery with his sexual energy, let's say that he's in business, he's succeeding, he's doing well, financially independent, free, maybe he has, you know, his health, his vitality. You know, a lot of men, not all men, some men, we can say, with that energy may get caught up in having multiple partners, multiple women, maybe, you know, getting lost in the sense of just having even threesomes or foursomes or having sex parties. My friend in Berlin says he has a really hard time finding a monogamous partner, which he wants, but that there's a lot of sex parties and polyamory that he doesn't vibe with. And I don't vibe with that energy either. So when we're looking at cultivating this energy, what's something that you can share with men who want that monogamy, who want one partner, but yet who have all this, now they have all this energy that may be attracting just, you know, hundreds of women at a time, or they go out in public and now they're just swarmed by women that they're not used to. You know, what do we do as for the man? What does he do in that state to be able to attract that one partner, his queen that he wants to be with, instead of getting lost in that energy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, this is such a major challenge, right? And we see this in the Tantra world happening all the time. Like there's an increase in your ability to hold power and magnetism, and the temptation is getting bigger and bigger and bigger to act upon that, you know, and to indulge. It's like the image of the snake in the garden, just offering the up apple of temptation, like all the time, and that temptation gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And so when I teach, there is a very big element where I talk about God and actually trying to understand, or at least have some understanding what God represents, and having that as the very thing to aim for. Like, what are we aiming for? And to have a clear image or a clear idea of like what we're aiming for, which I would assume the highest would be God, then that keeps the energy, then that keeps it on track. Is that there is something that there has to be something that transcends yourself, and that's, I feel, is what can keep man on track and keep aiming for the high as possible, basically.
And that's the divine masculine, right? The divine
Yes,
masculine.
that's a big topic, of course, to dive into what God is. But yes, it's often like in relationships, it's often seen as a trinity. So there's man, woman, and then there's God. And so there's this. It doesn't maybe it has to be God per se, but it has to be something that transcends the two of them. Like whether it's a vision or a purpose, it has to be, yeah, where the attention can come together and and in the process it cuts away all the distractions. Like I often say, like if you can't say no to sex, you'll never be able to say yes to it either. So it's a very big it's a big challenge to say no in order to get the full yes for what you actually really want.
It's beautiful. I was speaking with a woman about this yesterday, and Sadia, actually, she talks about relationships, and she had a video out, and I said, oh my gosh, because Jordan Peterson talks about this. She says, I know. I got it from Jordan, and Jordan Peterson has this video where he talks about for women, he said, women's highest value is in their ability to say no. And I found that really interesting around this concept of self-control, because we're talking about self-control, but it's an oxymoron, I think, as well, because the self-control that we're speaking to actually allows us to deepen into this beautiful multi-orgasmic experience, right? And so the self-control actually gifts us with more. And I think that's so true for women where, and I don't know if you found this with yourself and with other men, but most men who are of, let's say, high value, like for yourself, a man who has cultivated this mastery, he's not going to want to just give it away to any woman who's also with everyone else. You know, he's actually going to be more selective, right? And he's actually going to choose to gift that and share that with a woman who, in my experience, is capable of also holding that with him, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I see this often in relationships where a man starts to embark on this journey and then he needs to communicate that to her. And often at first it's not received very well. Like they don't fully understand, like, wait a minute, because there's so much like for women there is so much often a bit of an attachment to making him come. Like that's like a job well done. I mean, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but there is this
I've
feeling
done
of
my
like,
job. Yeah, exactly.
I can't make him come, then I'm falling short or something. And
Yeah.
so it takes a while for the man usually to be able to communicate that actually this is beneficial for me, but it will also be beneficial for you. And if a woman cannot go there with him and she really wants his semen, she keeps wanting his seed, then yeah, that's gonna create a bit of a split, a bit of a break. Um, so yeah.
There is an attachment, I feel, when we're looking at transactional exchanges. I have a girlfriend who's with someone, and I mentioned to her about this practice for me being only with a man who is practicing this practice. And she said, "Oh, well, I don't mind that my boyfriend ejaculates every time." And I'm like, "Well, how often are you having sex?" "Well, every day." And he, okay, little news alert here. He's gonna eventually not be able to bring to you what you really want. You're gonna get frustrated. He's gonna get frustrated. And now there's a higher probability, and this is my opinion, that he's going to go somewhere else to get excited, to get off, because he's getting off, right? In my experience, man who is cultivating their seed and maybe ejaculating every 3 months, for example, he has a higher likelihood of wanting to cultivate, because he's doing that for himself, right? Wanting to cultivate that relationship with his woman. And also, in my experience with men who don't ejaculate, I had an experience. We made love for 8 hours, and he was ready. He was ready to go a few hours later. Like, he was ready to go, and I'm like, I need a nap. I need to hydrate. I need sugar, fruit. Like, give me something to, And I was feeling amazing, and he. I remember, the next day we made love for 5 hours, and the day after for 5 hours, and it wasn't just sex, right? It was everything that was involved, because then the sexual experience becomes so much more profound and deeper with this evolved way of feeling each other and learning about each other and being with each other. So have you found that men are surprised? What's the reaction with a lot of men who come to you and work on this practice with you as a coach? What are some of the things that you find overall that they are surprised by, or that they may not know is possible when they start cultivating this energy with a partner, with a woman?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So men are very goal orientated, right? So taking out orgasm, which is often the goal, is initially very hard at first. But then once they accomplish that, they don't even have to be multi-orgasmic yet or any of these things, but just taking that out of the picture, at least temporarily, changes their entire experience. Because in that, now they can actually, they're able to resensitize themselves and to actually experience intimacy, because they're not so tunnel, they're not in tunnel vision towards that end destination. And then from there, the next step, it allows space for them to focus on her pleasure and, sure, maybe even also her orgasm. And often men find that becomes their new kind of pleasure. It's actually, her pleasure becomes his pleasure, or actually his satisfaction. There's a much greater satisfaction from seeing her in her absolute fullness, like that he's maybe never seen before, and that becomes, yeah, something much more fulfilling and satisfying than his own 10-second ejaculatory orgasm.
Right.
So, and she, of course, she once they reach that point, then he's on board, she's on board, and it takes everything to a whole other level.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. I want to talk about purpose driven by pleasure. It's something that you shared with me. Purpose driven by pleasure, and how the path of this practice involves moving through pain and opening beyond the pain, going deeper. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So in this process of semen retention, there is, like I said, like a resensitizing of the system. So men are opening themselves up to feel more pleasure, even though it seems like initially it's a bit of a sacrifice. They have to sacrifice, their 10 seconds of pleasure for something actually much bigger. And on the other hand, also, if once a man is actually in command and has mastery over this incredibly powerful force, then only he can truly be on his purpose, because until then something else is actually in the driver's seat, something else is moving him, which is often pleasure and not purpose. So I think only when a man is fully in full command of this force, then he can direct it towards his true purpose. And this is what I see happening. So yeah, and so you can have it all. Like you can have the pleasure and the purpose. It's not one or the other. It's not, even though initially it may seem like they have to sacrifice something. Like the semen retention essentially seems a bit like a sacrifice of pleasure at first, but it's trading it in for something, a whole new definition of pleasure even, which then becomes fuel to actually drive them towards their actual purpose.
Where does the pain come in?
Everywhere. So yes, so you can't really, if you resensitize your system to pleasure, you're also resensitizing it to pain. There's no way to pick and choose. It's a spectrum, and I often even look at pain and pleasure as both existing on the same spectrum. They're both friction. They're both energy moving through the body, and depending how we classify it, we'll say, okay, this is pleasurable, this is painful. But in reality, there is actually not much difference. It's just friction. So the journey of opening themselves up to feel and experience more pleasure is inevitably also going to open them up to potentially experiencing more also painful things, especially if there are certain tensions, distortions, traumas stored in the body. So the shadow work happens alongside of this entire process, and so it is an initiation into through the portals of pleasure and pain at the same time, because we cannot pick one or the other, unfortunately.
I love that. When I was with Madtak Chia in Thailand, he was laughing, saying, "You want pleasure? You also want pain? Equal pleasure, equal pain." And he's ha 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 laughing and wagging his dragon tail at us. And when I hear you say it as well, there's almost there's almost a relief in it when we talk about it, because often when I'm in a very deep pain, which comes from the past, something that's been maybe unresolved, or maybe I haven't felt it fully, or it's maybe controlling me in some way and dictating how I operate in the world or how I use my thoughts and belief system. And what I have found is so true what you're saying, because the more I allow myself to experience the highest pleasure, the most intense pleasure, I also have been met with the most intense pain, equally. And for me, studying with the Tao, knowing yin and yang is always going to find its harmony within itself, within the container of self. Knowing alchemy, that there's always going to be both masculine, feminine, equal in balance. And when we're not in balance, yin and yang, we have dis-ease, we have cancer, we have people, I've had friends just up and die recently in their 40s because they were seeking pleasure and they were met with intense pain, which caused them to die in tragic accidents, heart attacks. And I find that the key is in, like you're saying, we're cultivating the pleasure, and we're also making room and making space to allow the pain and not to judge. I think that's the key, right? Not judging pain as bad. Is that one of the ways that you work with the energy and transmute, as we say in alchemy, transmuting the energy is maybe just to allow it and understand that it's part of the process instead of placing a blame or judgment against it?
Yeah, having an element of equanimity and in the process. And of course, if there is a partner involved, then even more beautiful to be witnessed in the pleasure and the pain, which then ultimately will provide more sense of more intimacy also through that journey, that experience.
I have to add, and I'm curious your thoughts. Is that a maturation, a maturity in the man? Because in a lot of experiences in my past and with my girlfriends and my former clients as well, women, when we as women have been sexually abused in our past, for example, I had a client who was raped by her uncle at 4 years old, which is tragic. I mean, you think of a 4-year-old girl and it's just a horrible thing to think about, let alone have that experience. And she was in a relationship and really loved this man, and he loved her. But there was a lot, because I was working with her on our business, there was a lot that was coming up that I actually had to work with her on. But what I found was she was actually accepting her own pain. She wasn't in shame. She was accepting what had happened. She had a state of forgiveness. But often it's the man who may not have the capacity to hold that darkness. And I call it befriend your beast, or working with the dark side. But can you talk a little bit about, for the man specifically, when a woman comes to you, or when a woman comes to the men that you're working with, and they're just capable of like being open and free and moving through that pain, moving through their own sexual trauma with a man through this deep sexual healing experience. Do you find that for the man now in this practice that he has to deepen more to then cultivate that darkness within himself to be able to hold space for the feminine heart?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So a man can only hold as much space for his woman as he can hold space for his own feminine. So again, in the practice of semen retention, you're basically cultivating the feminine. You're cultivating this energy, which forces him to increase his capacity to hold or retain. So that in itself will increase his capacity to hold space for her as well. And of course, it goes both ways. There's going to be times where he's at his limit, and she brings in something that it's actually taking him beyond that limit. So he's being invited to then stretch open that space, that capacity to to hold. So he can. It's partially, of course, his own work between him and his own inner feminine, and then the actual relationship. And so both can help each other to increase that capacity to hold more space.
So when a man collapses in the presence of a woman opening like that, when he collapses or if he collapses, how does he come back? Because most of the time, I worked with David Detta, and his practice a lot is for men to learn how to stay open to that energy, that dark energy, that the feminine, the Kali energy that the feminine can bring, without collapsing. So what's one of the ways, a practical way that you can offer for men who are listening, who may or may not know they're collapsing, but now maybe they're more aware that they're collapsing in the expression of the feminine? What's one of the ways practically, what's something that they can do or practice in that moment of collapse?
Yeah, I think, for men, it can look often a bit different, right? Like if a man collapses, you may not even notice it. It's more like a shutting down. So they may even miss it themselves that it's actually happening. But yeah, so it's if it happens, it is always some sort of disconnect from the body, because there's an overwhelm in the body, and then men often retreat in their head, like they go into their head and they start logically trying to come up with solutions. Like they start strategizing. So the mind takes full control in order to sort of control, damage control the situation. I feel this may be counterintuitive, but this at this point, I feel I could say, yeah, the practice would be to come back in the body. But I think a more powerful thing to do is to put his attention on her even more, like go in full service, like forget about himself entirely,
Wow.
and just as a way to transcend. He's not in, as he forgets about himself, he's also transcending himself, and potentially transcending his own trauma and pain in that process is by fully stepping in the role of being of service even more, leaning in to be there for her even more, even though it sounds like he's denying himself in a way. It also has that opportunity to transcend it altogether.
Mm. It's interesting because the practice of the feminine is devotion, and what you shared is actually part of that feminine practice of devotion. So when the masculine loses its masculine, let's say if the masculine collapses into, I don't want to say emptiness because the masculine can be emptiness, but when the masculine collapses, let's say it's not in touch with masculine anymore, it's not contained as masculine in that moment. And you're actually saying to move into the feminine of devotion with his penetrative energy. So he's redirecting the penetration instead of within himself. He's of service and in devotion, which is the feminine, which is so interesting. And I feel my experience, and I was with a tantric practitioner many, many years ago, and we made love for 5 hours. And at the end, he said, "Oh my goodness, how are you doing this?" And I said, "Doing what?" I don't know what you're referring to. And he said, "Well, I've never been held by a woman like you. You need to show women how to hold the man." And I realized it was because I had studied Buddhism, really anchoring in my masculine. And I'm so comfortable holding my masculine, I'm so comfortable in my masculine energy that now, because I can hold myself, I can hold my feminine, and I'm allowing my feminine to play within my own container. And because of that, a man now, when he enters my space, feels safe, like his feminine can now enter my masculine, right? And now we get to play both full roles together in that space. I call that the Tao of Tantra. I don't like to say Tantra because I think people don't understand what that means. But for those listening, Tantra is where we negate nothing and allow all of it. And I'm not talking about polyamory, like allowing, like 8 sex partners in a night because you feel like it. It's like allowing, like Dennis is saying, allowing all of it to be present, and then to transmute, as we know in alchemy, to transmute with all of this energy. But when we're in tune, I find when I'm in tune with my own masculine directiveness and my own contained sense of self, and I'm anchored there, now I can then allow my feminine to emerge. And she's safe because I've got her. You know what I mean? Like I've got her. And when I meet a man who's like, "Oh my God, wow, I feel so held in your presence," it's so true what you're saying, because I can play with the masculine and allow him to come to me in his feminine. And now we're in that cultivation dance, instead of it being like, "Oh, no, you're the man, you have to be masculine, and I'm the woman, and I only can play this role of being submissive." And I find that women have no idea what it's actually like to make love because they're not in that cultivation state of both yin and yang. So one of the things that you shared with me is a man being able to lead a woman. And this is so interesting. I'd love for you to comment on it. So a man being able to lead a woman, but then shift into being led by her. So how can you give us an example, or what does that really look like in this practice?
Yeah. Yes, I do often say so. A man can only lead by listening to her. And it takes us back in what something we said before, that a man can actually not lead until he has mastered his sexual energy, because until then, the sexual energy is leading him, whether he knows it or not. So he has to take care of that first, and then he can actually start thinking about leading. And yes, like on the outside, it will look like he's leading. He's like when you dance tango, there's clearly somebody who leads, the man leads and the woman follows. So and he leads by making very small micro movements. He starts a movement, but then she finishes it. So most of the movement is actually hers. And he just makes a little adjustment with his hand, like a little push, a little this, and she just takes that and finishes it. And yeah, it's like even though he's leading the dance, he's deeply in touch with her rhythm, her speed, like and so he can only lead when he's sensitive enough to listen to her rhythm. So that's why even though he's leading, he's going exactly where she wants to go also. And so but he's not leading the interaction towards for his own self gratification. He's leading towards her most expansive expression over herself, because that's really, once he can set aside his own pleasure and all of that, his own goals, his own things, then it all becomes about her. His satisfaction is seeing her come into the fullest expression of who she is, and that's where he's leading her into. And yeah, this is the dance.
I love that. That's been my experience as well, and I love how you articulated that and shared that with us. I find that a lot of women are very resistant to being free in their own body, but mainly for me it's energy, and it's being playful, because if she can't dance in her own presence and she can't play her own music with her own body and her own rhythm, how is she going to feel safe to do that with a man? And if she's not comfortable and confident within herself to be able to do that for herself with her own energy, then what happens is she's going to be looking to the man to do all the work. And now he's exhausted, kind of bored and tired, and he's never given that opportunity to actually be a witness to her beauty and radiance, to even know what the feminine is, because he's so now caught up in his own experience, right? And he also wouldn't have an opportunity, like you're saying, to listen if she never allows herself to go to that place of expression, right? Like, how can he actually hear her and feel her if she can't even feel herself, right?
Yeah, yeah. And she can sense his level of mastery, like if his level of mastery is on point, then she feels safe, because then she knows that there's not something else that's in control of him. He's actually in control, and this sense of safety is going to result in her being able to fully surrender and just surrender into that.
So when it comes to your practice, your coaching practice, and we're looking at guiding men who may be practicing with you early on and feeling awkward, what's something that you can share with them that would help them in understanding that this is something that they really want to be able to do, even though there's going to be that awkward stage at first where they're maybe a little bit in their head, not really clear? what's a way that you help guide people so people understand some of the coaching that you offer? Because I think it's important that people really, consider working with someone like yourself in this way, being guided, being shown a foundation of how to engage, and, being urged in a positive way, being given positive reinforcement, knowing that they can do this, it's good for them. But what's something that you can share that may help them in that initial awkward stage when they're with a woman and feeling, wait, I don't have this, and now they're caught up in their head?
Yeah, it's so important to remember that it's not a performance, it's self-expression, and yeah, and this is something that I really keep telling them is to keep reminding themselves, okay, it is an act of self-expression, and yes, and initially, like taking orgasm out of the picture, at least for him, it feels a bit like a bad deal, like it's initially, yeah, at first. So my role is often to get men at least through the first 30 days, so they can get a taste of what's on the other side of this, like what is in it for me, even if anything. So they have to taste that, and then they realize, like, oh yeah, this is worth this little sacrifice. This is worth pursuing. And then the feedback he gets from her is hopefully, most likely, is also going to be reinforcing his continuous practice of discipline, because, and it's often also because of women that men decide to do this practice, because they're starting to understand, like, if I want to meet her fully, like really in the way she's asking me to, I have to deal with this. I have to do this. Otherwise, I'll always fall short. Not just sexually, but also just simply emotionally, being able to meet her emotionally. Yeah.
It's beautiful. Cultivating chi power, semen retention as a way of gifting to yourself and your beloved, your lover, an experience of opening, exploring deeper realms of devotion, divinity, and self-enlightenment, and purposeful connection, intimacy. There's so many benefits: health, vitality, well-being, longer life, stronger body, stronger ability to make decisions, clear-mindedness, direction, confidence, self-assurance, being able to attract that higher quality woman that really honors them and wants to be honored by them. So there's so many benefits to this practice. Is there anything else, Dennis, that you want to add that we didn't cover before we close out?
Yeah, no, you're right. And like, so it is really the elixir of life. Like, literally, semen is life-giving. So unless we're intending to give life, in meaning like to conceive a child, then all this potentiality can be used for giving life to yourself. So it is in a sense like, yeah, life-giving, and for yourself, and also for her, of course. And to be able to cultivate that is almost like, not just birthing a new life, a new human being, but in a way you're birthing yourself in that process continuously.
Yeah, reinventing your own self and emerging as a more potent being in the world, and really accessing more, right? More of you, like you said, more fullness, more of you, which then allows you to give more to your partner, which then allows her to feel, just so beautiful and loved and held and appreciated. And then naturally she's going to want to give more to him because she feels well taken care of and honored, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here with OG Mastery, with me. I appreciate your time and your energy and your practice. I value this practice very deeply, and it's something that I encourage women to learn more about and men to master, cultivating their sexual energy. Dennis offers coaching, and you can find him on Instagram, the Shaktivator. Dennis, it was wonderful to have you here. I appreciate you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
OG Mastery, the original gangsta, God and Goddess, all coming into mastery. We're coming into you. This is where we talk business, sex, relationships, money, health, entrepreneurship, and self-awareness.